The moment Adelaide Dalton stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, she already knew she did not belong there. And the way the dust swirled up around her worn boots, and the crowd of strangers stared seemed to confirm every dark thought she had ever entertained about herself. She was 24 years old, and she had traveled 3 days and 2 nights from San Antonio with nothing but a battered carpet bag, a bruised pride, and the sort of quiet desperation that a woman learns to carry when the world has made it clear, repeatedly, that she is not particularly wanted in it. Her dark hair was pinned back in a loose knot, several strands escaping in the dry Texas wind. Her dress had once been a deep burgundy, but years of washing and hard living had faded it to something closer to the color of old brick. There was a small scar along the left side of her jaw, a thin pale crescent she had gotten as a child when she fell from a fence post, and it was the first thing she assumed people noticed when they looked at her. She had spent years being certain it was the last thing they remembered, too. Harlan Creek was not a glamorous town. It had one main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other with room to spare, flanked by a general store, a post office, a barber shop, a saloon with a sign that had lost its second letter so it read the ROYA Hotel, and a livery stable at the far end that smelled strongly of hay and horse sweat even from a distance. There was a church at the north edge of town with a crooked steeple, and a schoolhouse painted white that had gone gray. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, and a stranger with a carpet bag and haunted eyes attracted attention whether she wanted it or not. She wanted none of it. She had come to Harlan Creek because her aunt, Dorothea Voss, had written to say there was work at the town's small boarding house, and that respectable work in a respectable place was what Adelaide needed after the disaster in San Antonio. Dorothea had not spelled out what she thought that disaster was, but she did not need to. Adelaide knew what had happened. She had trusted a man who did not deserve it, worked for a family who treated her as less than furniture, and when everything fell apart, she had been the one left standing in the street with her bag at her feet and no one to blame but her own poor judgment. So here she was, Harlan Creek. Population 312, according to the painted wooden sign at the edge of town that someone had updated recently with a lick of fresh paint. She squared her shoulders, picked up her bag, and walked toward the boarding house her aunt had described in the letter. It was easy enough to find. It sat on the quieter side of the main street, a 2-story clapboard structure with a neat front porch and flower boxes under the windows. The flowers were struggling valiantly in the Texas heat, half alive and half not, and Adelaide felt a sudden, unexpected kinship with them. Dorothea Voss was a stout woman in her 50s with clever gray eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Adelaide had always respected even when it made her uncomfortable. She opened the door before Adelaide reached the porch steps, as if she had been watching from the window, which she very likely had been. "You look like you need feeding," Dorothea said, which was her version of hello. "I need a bed more than food," Adelaide replied. "You can have both," Dorothea said, and stepped aside to let her in. The boarding house was called Voss House, though the sign out front just said ROOMS. It had 6 guest rooms, a common dining room, a small kitchen that Dorothea ruled with the iron authority of a general, and a back garden that grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs with considerably more success than the struggling flowers out front. There were currently 3 boarders in residence. A traveling dry goods salesman named Cutter who stayed 2 weeks of every month, an old widowed cattle hand named Jasper Pell who had nowhere else to go, and a young schoolteacher named Miss Evelyn Cross who had come from Missouri and was quietly terrified of horses, which Adelaide privately thought was an interesting affliction for someone living in the Texas frontier. Adelaide would be helping Dorothea with the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, and the general management of the house in exchange for her room and a small wage. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest and it was hers, and after the wreckage of San Antonio, honest and hers felt like more than enough. She slept 12 hours the first night, woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee, and told herself that whatever Harlan Creek turned out to be, she would make the best of it. What she did not anticipate, on her third morning in town, was the horse. More specifically, she did not anticipate the horse that came barreling down the main street at a full gallop, without a rider, eyes wide and terrified, heading directly toward the chicken crates stacked outside the general store, where Adelaide happened to be standing with a list of supplies Dorothea needed. She dove to the left, which was the correct instinct, and the horse thundered past and knocked over exactly one of the crates, sending chickens scattering in every direction across the street in a great explosion of feathers and outrage. Adelaide sat in the dust, heart hammering, chickens running around her in all directions, and stared up at the sky for a moment just to confirm she was still alive. "You all right?" The voice came from her right. She turned her head and found a pair of worn leather boots standing beside her, attached to a pair of long legs in dusty trail pants, and above that a man crouching down to her level with one arm extended to help her up. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown eyes that were sharp and warm at the same time, a contradictory combination she had not often encountered. He wore a battered brown hat pushed back slightly on his head, and his shirt had seen better days but was clean. There was a long rope coiled at his hip, and his hands when she took the offered one were rough and calloused in the particular way of a man who worked cattle for a living. "Fine," she said, somewhat automatically, because that was always her first answer to that question regardless of the truth. He helped her to her feet with practiced ease, and then spent a moment chasing down one of the escaped chickens with a calm efficiency that suggested he was not a man easily flustered by chaos. He caught it, returned it to the overturned crate with a gentleness that surprised her, and set the crate upright. "That horse belong to anybody?" Adelaide asked, brushing dust from her skirt. "Belongs to a ranch hand out at the Parker spread," the man said. "Lost its rider about a mile back. Fellow got bucked off and he is going to have quite a walk back to town." He picked up her supply list, which had blown into the dirt, and handed it back to her with a slight nod. "Nelson Mercer," he said. "Adelaide Dalton," she replied, and was already turning toward the store door. She did not think much of it in the moment. He was just a man who had helped her up from the dirt, and the West was full of men who would help a woman up from the dirt. That was not remarkable. What was remarkable, she discovered over the following days, was that he kept appearing. Not in a threatening way, not even in a particularly deliberate way, at least not at first. It was simply that Harlan Creek was a small town, and Nelson Mercer was apparently a fixture of it. He came into the general store while she was there 2 days later to pick up fence wire and salt. She saw him at the end of the street talking with the livery man the following morning. He stopped to tip his hat to her aunt when Dorothea was sweeping the front porch, and Dorothea, who did not warm to most people quickly, smiled at him like they were old acquaintances. "You know that man?" Adelaide asked her aunt that evening. "Nelson Mercer." "Of course I know him," Dorothea said, as if this were a self-evident statement. "Everybody in Harlan Creek knows Nelson Mercer. He runs the Mercer Ranch out about 4 miles east of town. His father started it, God rest the man. Nelson took it over about 3 years ago when his father passed, and he has done a fine job of it. Good man, quiet, works hard." She paused in her stirring of the pot on the stove. "Why are you asking?" "No reason," Adelaide said. She was not asking for the reason Dorothea clearly suspected. She was asking because in a town of 300 people where she knew almost no one, he was simply a point of reference, something familiar in an unfamiliar place. That was all. At least, that was what she told herself. The Sunday market in Harlan Creek happened once a month in the open field beside the church, and it was one of the social events of the town, the kind that brought everyone out regardless of whether they had anything to buy or sell. Dorothea sent Adelaide with a basket of herb bundles she had dried and a small crock of preserves, and told her to get a fair price for them and to talk to people, because Adelaide had the tendency to stand at the edge of a room and observe rather than participate, and Dorothea felt strongly that this was a habit that needed breaking. Adelaide set up her small table between a woman selling quilts and a man selling carved wooden handles for tools, and spent the first hour being largely ignored, which suited her fine. She watched the town move around her. There were families with small children, ranch hands in their Sunday clothes, older men trading tobacco and opinions with equal enthusiasm, and younger women moving in small clusters, evaluating everything with the particular intensity of people who had limited access to novelty. She was rearranging the herb bundles for the third time when she became aware of someone standing at the corner of her table. She looked up, and it was Nelson Mercer. He was not in his trail clothes today. He wore a clean dark shirt and what she suspected were his best pants, and he had combed his hair under a slightly better hat than the battered one she had first seen him in. He was looking at the crock of preserves with what appeared to be genuine interest. "What kind?" he asked. "Peach and ginger," she said. "My mother used to make peach preserves," he said, not in a sentimental, trying to impress way, but in the simple way of a man reporting a fact. "Never thought to put ginger in them." "My aunt's recipe," Adelaide said. "The ginger keeps it from being too sweet." He bought the crock. He also bought a bundle of dried rosemary that he claimed was for the bunkhouse cook, who had recently developed ambitions in the kitchen that exceeded the cook's actual skill but not his enthusiasm. Adelaide almost smiled at that. Almost. He lingered a moment longer than the transaction required, looking at her with those warm, direct eyes that she found slightly unsettling, because most men either looked at her with indifference or with the particular evaluative attention that made her want to step backward. He looked at her with neither of those things. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are genuinely curious about. "You are the woman staying with Dorothea Voss," he said. "Working for her," Adelaide corrected. "I am not a charity case." A slight shift at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but close. "I did not say you were." There is a difference between staying with someone and working for them, and most people who come to a new town to work would not feel the need to make that distinction quite so fast. "Makes me think someone has mistaken you for something you are not before." Adelaide stared at him. That was an unusually perceptive thing for a man to say to a woman he had met once in a cloud of chicken feathers. "You need anything else?" she asked, which was her way of indicating that the conversation was over. "No," he said pleasantly. "Good day, Miss Dalton." He touched the brim of his hat and walked away, and she watched him go for just a moment longer than she intended to. The following week, she was hauling water from the town pump when the handle slipped, and she drenched her apron and the front of her dress, and said a word that would have made her aunt raise her eyebrows. Nelson Mercer, who appeared to simply exist in proximity to her inconvenient moments, was tying his horse to the post nearby. He turned at the sound, took in the situation, and came over to help her reset the pump handle without being asked and without making a production of it. "Thank you," she said, wringing out her apron. "You are welcome," he said, and then, because apparently he could not resist, "You do seem to attract disaster at a higher rate than most." "That is not something I needed pointed out," she said. "No," he agreed, in a tone that was somehow also agreeable and gently amused at the same time. "Probably not." She looked at him sidelong. "Do you always say whatever you are thinking?" "Mostly," he said. "Life is shorter out here than it ought to be sometimes. Seems wasteful to talk around things." She did not know how to respond to that, so she picked up her water bucket and walked back toward the boarding house, and she did not look back. But she thought about what he had said for the rest of the afternoon, in the way you think about something that has rattled a window you had thought was shut. A month into her time in Harlan Creek, Adelaide had settled into the rhythms of Voss House well enough that Dorothea trusted her to manage the dining room and kitchen on her own on Thursdays, when Dorothea went to the Women's Charitable Society meeting. It was on one of these Thursdays that a new boarder arrived. His name was Frank Aldrich, and he was 35 and well-dressed in the deliberate way of a man who wants you to notice how well-dressed he is. He said he was in the area to assess some land for potential purchase, though he was vague about the specifics in a way Adelaide noticed, but did not comment on. He was charming in the practiced, smooth way of a salesman, and he had the particular talent of making every compliment sound like a favor he was doing you. He complimented Adelaide's cooking at dinner with an attention that made Miss Evelyn Cross look uncomfortable and made old Jasper Pell narrow his eyes. Adelaide thanked him politely and cleared the plates. She was not a naive woman. She had met men like Frank Aldrich before. He tried to engage her in conversation in the hallway the next morning, and she was courteous but brisk. He offered to help her carry the laundry basket down the stairs, and she declined with a smile that did not reach her eyes. He left her a small folded note that she found under her workroom door that evening, written in slanted handwriting, saying that she was the most interesting woman he had encountered in his recent travels, and he hoped she would do him the honor of walking with him Sunday afternoon. She threw it in the stove. She did not mention it to Dorothea because Dorothea would have evicted the man immediately, and Adelaide did not want to be the cause of lost income for the boarding house. She told herself she could manage Frank Aldrich. She had managed worse. She was in the garden the following afternoon, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, when Nelson Mercer appeared at the back gate. He had never come to the boarding house before, and she sat back on her heels and looked up at him with more surprise than she intended to show. "Dorothea asked me to drop off a repair for the front gate latch," he said, holding up a small iron piece. "Told me she mentioned it to you." "She did not," Adelaide said. He looked slightly amused again. "Well, she mentioned it to me, which is what matters." He looked at the garden. "Those tomatoes are going to be something in another few weeks." "They are doing better than I expected," Adelaide admitted. She stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I did not take you for a man who does gate repair." "I am a man who does what needs doing," he said simply. "The blacksmith is backed up with wagon wheel orders, and Dorothea has been struggling with that latch for 2 months. Took me 20 minutes at my own forge." He moved toward the front of the house to fit the piece, and Adelaide followed, partly out of courtesy and partly out of the strange gravitational pull of his company that she was beginning to find irritating because she could not explain it. He fitted the latch with quiet, competent efficiency and tested it several times and pronounced it good, and then he turned and found Frank Aldrich standing on the front porch watching them with an expression that Adelaide did not particularly care for. Nelson looked at Frank. Frank looked at Nelson. Adelaide looked at neither of them and went inside. She heard Dorothea arrive home a few minutes later, and the sound of the 2 older boarders' voices in the dining room, and then, 20 minutes after that, a brief exchange of male voices on the porch that she could not quite make out. When she went back to the front of the house, Nelson was gone and Frank was in the parlor reading a newspaper with the studied nonchalance of a man pretending he had not been doing something else moments before. She did not ask what had been said. It was not her business, but Frank Aldrich was notably less persistent in his attentions after that evening. He was still charming at dinner, still smooth and well-dressed, but the notes stopped and the offers to accompany her places stopped, and he left Voss House 12 days after he arrived with a courteous farewell to Dorothea and a neutral nod to Adelaide. She did not ask Nelson about it either, the next time she saw him. But she found herself wondering. The summer heat in Harlan Creek was a physical thing, something you had to negotiate with every morning and surrender to by mid-afternoon. Adelaide had grown up in the heat, and she managed it well enough. But on the hottest days the boarding house felt like a bread oven, and the only relief was the big oak tree at the back of the property that threw a wide shade in the late afternoon. She had taken to sitting under it for 30 minutes before supper preparations began, just breathing, just being still, which was a luxury she did not often allow herself. She had a habit of motion, of keeping herself busy enough that the quieter thoughts could not catch up to her. But the oak tree in the late afternoon became a small exception to that rule. Nelson found her there one evening in late June. He had come to return a preserving jar Dorothea had lent him for something, and Dorothea had sent him around back. And so he came around the corner of the house and found Adelaide sitting in the grass with her back against the oak tree and her eyes closed, and he stopped immediately as if he had walked into a room where someone was sleeping. She heard him and opened her eyes. He was standing a few feet away holding the jar, looking slightly uncertain in a way she had not seen on him before. "Sorry," he said. "I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," she said, which surprised her slightly because she had thought she would mind. He looked at the ground, then at the tree, and then in the manner of a man who has made a decision said, "May I?" and nodded at the grass a few feet away. She nodded and he sat down, long legs folded, hat in his hands, and for a while they simply sat there together in the shade while the late afternoon light turned everything golden, and the heat began its slow retreat, and the sounds of the town carried faintly over the fence. It was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, surprisingly easy. "Where did you come from?" he asked eventually, not intrusively, just quietly curious. "San Antonio," she said. "Before that, a little town called Keller. You would not know it." "North of Fort Worth," he said, and she looked at him sharply. He shrugged one shoulder. "I drove cattle through that country once years ago. Nothing much to it." "No," she agreed. "Nothing much to it." She picked a blade of grass and turned it between her fingers. "You grew up here, in Harlan Creek." "Born about 2 miles from where I live now," he said. "My father homesteaded the land in the 60s, fought to keep it during hard years." He was quiet for a moment. He was a good man, plain-spoken, fair, didn't ask anything of anyone that he didn't ask of himself first. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "I try to be the same." "You manage it mostly," she said, and was startled to hear herself say it because it was both more personal and more complimentary than she had intended. He looked at her with those warm brown eyes, and there was something in them that she almost could not look at directly because it was too open, too unguarded, and she was not accustomed to being looked at that way. "What happened in San Antonio?" he asked, in the gentle way of a man who will accept a no as easily as a yes. It was quiet for a moment. "I worked for a family there, the Hendersons. Good pay, steady work, respectable." The man of the house turned out to be a great deal less respectable than his address suggested. She said it flatly, letting the facts carry the weight without embellishment, because she had found that embellishment invited a kind of pity she did not want and could not use. "When I made it clear his attentions were unwelcome, he told his wife I had been trying to steal from them. She believed him. I was put out with no reference and half a month's wages." She met his eyes. "So that is what happened in San Antonio." Nelson was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful, not in a way that minimized what she had said, but in a way that honored it. "That is a rotten thing," he said, "and it is a wrong one." "Yes," she said simply, "and you came here." "My aunt offered me honest work," she said. "That was worth traveling for." He nodded, looking at the fence. "For what it is worth," he said, "Harlan Creek is a decent town. There are troublesome people in it like everywhere, but mostly it is decent. And the people in it have treated you poorly, I hope." "They have been mostly polite," she said. "Curious, but polite." "Curious is fair," he said. "You are new." "People stare," she said, and her hand went briefly, involuntarily, to the scar along her jaw. He watched the gesture, said nothing about it for a moment. Then in the same quiet way he said most things, "That scar does not do what you think it does." She looked at him. "Excuse me." "You touch it when you think someone is looking at you," he said. "Like you are trying to remember it is there so you can account for whatever they are thinking, but it is not what people are looking at. Or if they are looking because it gives your face character, which it does." Adelaide stared at him for a full 3 seconds. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Not one person in her entire life. She did not know whether to be grateful or embarrassed or angry, and so she felt all three at once, which was disorienting. "You are very direct," she said, which was all she could manage. "I told you," he said. "Life is short out here." She looked away across the garden, and the silence that followed was different from the silences she usually inhabited. less like emptiness and more like the space between sentences where something important is still being said. She stood up after a while and said she needed to start supper, and he said he needed to get back before dark, and they both went in opposite directions without making any arrangement to see each other again. But she knew, in the uncomplicated way of a person who has stopped lying to herself about small things, that she had wanted to stay. July brought a heat that was merciless even by Texas standards, and it brought with it the town's annual Independence Day celebration, which was held on the main street with bunting and a barbecue, and a fiddle player named Old Pete Garza, who had been playing at these events for longer than anyone could quite remember. Dorothea insisted Adelaide come, and Adelaide put on her second-best dress, which was actually her best dress since the best one had been rendered unpresentable by an incident with a dye batch in the laundry, and went. The town had a warmth to it in celebration mode that it did not always have on ordinary days. The women had set up tables with food. The children were running everywhere. The men were gathered around the barbecue pits, with the focused sociability of people who are ostensibly talking about weather and cattle, but are really just enjoying the company. Old Pete Garza was already playing under the cottonwood trees at the end of the street, and a few couples were dancing on the flattened earth that served as an impromptu dance floor. Adelaide helped carry dishes to the tables and accepted a plate of food from a woman named Clara Whitmore, who was one of those cheerful, well-meaning individuals who makes it their personal mission to ensure that nobody at any gathering feels overlooked. Clara was the wife of the town's doctor, and she had a daughter of 6 and twin sons of 4, and the energy of someone who had somehow arranged for days to contain 30 hours. "You are Adelaide Dalton," Clara said, with the satisfied tone of a person who has done research. "Dorothea's niece." "Working for her, yes," Adelaide said, and Clara smiled as if this distinction were charming. "I have heard good things," Clara said, "from several people." She glanced toward the end of the street, including Nelson Mercer, who told my husband the other week that Dorothea had hired the most capable and impressive woman he had encountered since his mother. Adelaide looked at Clara. Clara looked back with the innocent expression of someone who has just delivered a grenade and is waiting to see what happens. "That was kind of him," Adelaide said carefully. "He does not say things he does not mean," Clara said. "Everyone knows that about Nelson. He is not a man for flattery, so when he says a thing, it carries weight." She sighed contentedly and steered Adelaide toward the food tables. "He has not stepped out with anyone since Mary Bate Halloran left town 3 years ago, you know. Not for lack of opportunity, he is simply particular." Adelaide applied herself to her plate and did not respond to this, which did not seem to discourage Clara in the slightest. She found Nelson later in the evening, near the edge of the dance floor. The light was lower by then, the sky going deep orange and purple overhead, and the lanterns strung between the posts and trees had been lit, casting a warm, unsteady glow over everything. He was standing with 2 other men she recognized as ranchers from the area, talking in the easy, sporadic way of men who do not need to fill every silence. He saw her, and extracted himself from the conversation with a word and a nod and walked over. "You look better than this occasion deserves," he said, which was either a compliment to her or an insult to the occasion and possibly both. "That is a strange thing to say," she told him. "I mean the dress," he said. "The color is good on you." He said it without the sleek, deliberate quality of Frank Aldrich's compliments. He said it the way he said everything, as though it were simply true and therefore worth noting. "Are you enjoying yourself?" "More than I expected to," she admitted. Old Pete Garza struck up a waltz which was ambitious of him and his fiddle, and the dance floor filled with couples. Nelson looked at the dancers, then at Adelaide, and then he said, "I am not a particularly skilled dancer, but I am not entirely hopeless either if you are willing." She almost said no. She had the no ready at the front of her mouth, but she looked at him at the uncomplicated honesty in his face, and she said, "All right then." He was exactly as advertised, not skilled but not hopeless, steady and deliberate and considerate of her movements, one hand at her waist and one holding hers at the proper distance of a man who is being respectful on purpose. She was a better dancer than he was, and he knew it and did not seem troubled by it, which she found she appreciated more than she would have expected. "You have done this before," he said. "My mother made sure of it," she said. She said a woman who could not dance was a woman at a disadvantage. "Your mother sounds like a practical woman." "She was," Adelaide said in the past tense, and he heard it and did not press. They danced one dance, and then a second one because old Pete Garza went directly from the waltz into a reel, and they were already there. Adelaide was laughing by the end of the reel, genuinely laughing, because Nelson had executed a turn with such sincere determination and so little grace that it was impossible not to find it funny, and he was laughing too, low and quiet, and they stood at the edge of the dance floor in the lantern light with their breath a little short from the reel and the laughter, and for a moment Adelaide Dalton felt simply, uncomplicated, happy. It frightened her. She knew how to manage her life when it was difficult. She did not entirely know what to do when it was not. She made an excuse about needing to find Dorothea, and he let her go without making it feel like an exit, which was generous of him. In the weeks that followed the 4th of July, Adelaide and Nelson fell into a pattern that neither of them seemed to have decided on exactly, but that materialized anyway. He came by Voss' house once or twice a week on some pretext or other. A repair needed, a delivery for Dorothea, a book he thought she might like that he had borrowed from the traveling lending library that made its circuit through the county every few months. She began saving the interesting things she read for when he came, not because she planned to, but because they accumulated and he was the person she thought would find them interesting. He lent her a book about the natural history of Texas that she read in 3 days, and which led to a long conversation one evening on the porch steps about the Edwards Plateau and the specific peculiarities of hill country weather, which led to him describing a cattle drive he had done through that country 2 years ago, which led to her telling him about the time she had gotten spectacularly lost as a child in the scrubland outside Keller and been found by a neighboring rancher's wife, who had given her biscuits and taken her home on horseback without a word of reproach. He listened the way he did everything, with his full attention, not waiting for her to finish so he could say his own thing but actually listening, and she found herself saying things she had not planned to say because the listening made them possible. She was not unaware of what was happening. She was not a foolish woman, and she had not spent her life refusing to understand her own feelings. She knew that she looked forward to his visits. She knew that, when he came around the corner of the house, she felt something ease in her chest that she had not realized was tight until it released. She knew that the days he did not come felt slightly too long, and she thought about this and considered it carefully and then took it apart piece by piece and tried to find reasons why it was inadvisable. She was good at this. She had spent years being good at this. She told herself that she was new in town and had few friends, and so his company was simply filling a social need. She told herself that he was kind to everyone, and she should not mistake general decency for particular interest. She told herself that she was not the kind of woman a man like Nelson Mercer would choose when he got around to choosing, because she had no family money, no notable history, a faded dress and a scarred jaw, and a past that the decent people of San Antonio had arranged to paint in whatever colors suited them. She was, in short, not worth a second glance. She told herself this one evening in late August while he was sitting across from her at the small table in the back garden, where Dorothea had taken to leaving a pitcher of tea and 2 cups on warm evenings, because she was a woman who saw things clearly and had no patience for things moving more slowly than they needed to. She told herself she was not worth a second glance, and she believed it with the practiced conviction of a woman who has repeated something so many times it has worn grooves in her thinking. And then Nelson Mercer looked up from the book he had been reading aloud to her, some passage he had marked because he thought she would appreciate it, and he found her looking at the fence with that expression she sometimes had, the one that was private and distant and faintly sad, and he said, "What are you thinking about?" She answered honestly before she could stop herself, "About why someone like you bothers with someone like me." He was quiet for a moment. "Someone like you," he repeated. "Tell me what that means." She shook her head. "I am not complaining. I simply mean that you must know there are women in this town and in every town who would be a more natural choice for the company of a man in your position. More settled women, women with more to recommend them." He set the book down. He looked at her in that direct, unhurried way of his. "Adelaide," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without the miss in front of it, and it did something unexpected to the quality of the air between them. "Do you believe that?" "Yes," she said, because she did. "Then you are wrong," he said simply, without drama. "And I am not saying that to be polite, because I think you know by now that I am not particularly skilled at saying things just to be polite." He looked at her steadily. "I am here because there is no one I would rather be here with. That is the only math that matters to me." Adelaide looked at him. He looked back. The evening light was doing what it did in late August, that long golden stretch before sunset that made everything look like a painting of itself. "I have a scar," she said, not as a complaint but as a fact she was presenting. "I know," he said. "I have looked at it many times. It does not change anything. I have no family money, no property, no notable connections." "Neither do most people in this territory," he said. "I am not looking for connections. I have a ranch and a good living from it, and I do not need anyone to supplement that. My history in San Antonio is something that happened to you," he said, with a quiet firmness that stopped her, "not something that defines you. The Hendersons of San Antonio are not the people who get to decide what you are worth, and neither are you, for that matter, if you are planning to decide in that direction." She stared at him. "You told me you are not worth a second glance," he said quietly. "You said it right now in different words, but that is what you meant." He held her gaze. "Good thing I use both eyes then." Adelaide Dalton had not cried in front of another person in 4 years. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she felt something shift in her chest at those words, some long-locked thing that had been waiting in the dark, and her eyes stung and she looked away very quickly and pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. "That was not," she managed after a moment, "a very fair thing to say." "No," he agreed softly. "But it was true." She looked back at him. She did not know what her face was doing, and for once she did not try to manage it. "Nelson," she said. "Yes." "I do not know how to do this," she said. "Not properly. I have not had much occasion to trust people." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to trust me all at once. I am just asking you to let me keep showing up." He picked up the book again, not to avoid the moment but to ease the weight of it, which she thought was kind. "Shall I keep reading?" she breathed. The long golden light lay across the garden. Somewhere over the fence, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire with aggressive enthusiasm. "Yes," she said. "Keep reading." What followed was September, which was the loveliest month in that part of Texas, when the heat finally relented, and the sky turned a deeper blue, and the air in the mornings had a sharpness to it that felt like a promise. Adelaide's life at Voss House had taken on a quality of settledness that she had not experienced in a long time, the sense of belonging to a place and having the place belong to you in return. She had made friends. Clara Whitmore had become a genuine ally, the sort of friend who shows up with food when you are unwell, and who says what she means without dressing it in unnecessary softness. Miss Evelyn Cross had conquered, or at least brokered a lasting ceasefire with, her fear of horses, and she and Adelaide had taken to walking together on Sunday mornings, which Adelaide found she enjoyed more than she would have predicted. Old Jasper Pell, the widowed cattle hand, had taken to leaving small carved wooden figures on the dining room table, little horses and rabbits and birds that he whittled in the evenings, and he left them the way cats leave gifts, without ceremony or acknowledgement, and Adelaide collected them in her room and thought each one was remarkable. And there was Nelson. Nelson came twice a week, then 3 times. They talked and read and sat in the garden. He took her riding once, out to a stretch of land east of town, where the hills rolled in a way that Adelaide found beautiful, in the same way that wide open spaces can be simultaneously beautiful and a little terrifying. And she said so, and he agreed and said he had always felt the same, which surprised her because he seemed to belong so entirely to that landscape. "You can belong to a place and still be struck by it," he said. "Maybe especially then." He was working her towards something, she knew. He was not a man who moved without direction. And she was moving toward it too, though she kept stopping to examine herself and her reasons and her fears with the diligence of a woman who has been burned before and has not forgotten what fire feels like. He kissed her on a Wednesday in the middle of September, in the back garden, in the shade of the oak tree that had become something like their tree by that point. She had been showing him the progress of the tomatoes, because they had come in magnificently, and she was inordinately proud of them, and he had been listening and looking at them with the appropriate appreciation. And then she had looked up at him to make some further point about the specific soil composition she and Dorothea had worked out, and he was looking at her, not at the tomatoes, and the sentence dissolved. He kissed her slowly and gently, and with the same quality of care that characterized everything he did, and she kissed him back and felt the last of the tight, defended thing in her chest open like a fist releasing. They stood in the shade of the oak tree with the afternoon light around them, and Adelaide Dalton thought that this was something she had not expected, and that she was grateful for it with an entirety that was brand new. "I have been wanting to do that for a while," he said. "I noticed," she said. He laughed, and she liked the sound of it very much. Dorothea was entirely unsurprised. She received the news of their courtship with the satisfied expression of a person who has been watching pieces move toward an inevitable conclusion, and is glad the board has finally caught up with her predictions. "He is a good man," she said to Adelaide, in a matter-of-fact way that carried everything she intended it to carry. "He was a good son, and he has been a good neighbor, and he is honest when it would be easier to be convenient. Those things matter more than most." "I know," Adelaide said. "Do you also know," Dorothea said, with the crisp directness of a woman who loves fiercely and shows it by being clear, "that you are worth exactly as much as any woman in this county and considerably more than most?" "Because I want to make sure that is also in your accounting." Adelaide looked at her aunt. Dorothea had never been soft, had never been the coddling sort, had shown her love in the provision of work and food and honest speech, and Adelaide had sometimes as a younger woman wished for something warmer. Now she thought there was nothing warmer than someone who saw you clearly and wanted you anyway. "I am working on that," Adelaide said. "Work faster," said Dorothea, and poured her a cup of coffee. The fall brought the ranch busy season, and Nelson's visits became shorter and less frequent through October as he managed the autumn cattle work, the accounting, the preparations for winter, and the dozen other demands that a working ranch made on its owner. Adelaide understood this and did not resent it, but the shorter visits made her aware of how much space he had come to occupy in her daily landscape. She began going out to the Mercer ranch on Saturday afternoons instead, riding out on the gentle roan mare that Dorothea kept for errands. The ranch was 4 miles east of town, and it was a good ranch, not extravagant but solid. A main house that Nelson had been slowly improving since he took it over, barns in good repair, pastures that showed the care of a man who takes the long view. There were 3 hands who lived in the bunkhouse, men named Cal, Domingo, and a taciturn young man named William who had appeared at the ranch gate looking for work the previous spring, and had proved himself invaluable with horses. The hands treated her with respectful warmth, the particular manner of men who take their cues from the man they work for, and Nelson treated her with such uncomplicated respect and regard that she understood his men were simply following a pattern he had long since established. She helped sometimes with the kitchen at the ranch, which had been suffering under the well-intentioned but limited skill of Cal, who had appointed himself cook with more enthusiasm than ability. She brought recipes from Dorothea's collection and made enough food for the week and taught Cal 2 things he could reliably repeat, which she considered a genuine contribution to the ranch's welfare. Nelson watched her move through his home with an expression she had finally learned to read, which was a kind of quiet, steady gladness, the expression of a man who has been alone long enough to understand the particular quality of what it is to not be. One afternoon in November, while she was in the ranch kitchen and Nelson was in the office going over his accounts, Domingo knocked at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands, which was his gesture of apology. "Miss Dalton," he said, "there is a man at the gate asks if a Miss Dalton is here, says his name is Henderson." Adelaide went very still. She set down the pot she was holding. She thought for a moment carefully about what this could mean. Robert Henderson, of the Hendersons of San Antonio, had a son named Clark who was somewhere close to her own age, and she had occasionally suspected that Robert Henderson's accusations against her had been designed not only to punish her for rebuffing him, but also to prevent any of his family from examining his behavior too closely. "Tell him I will come to the gate," she said. "Ma'am, Mr. Mercer." "I will handle it," she said, and went. The man at the gate was not Robert Henderson. It was his son Clark Henderson, 26 years old, whom Adelaide had met once at a family supper when she first came to work for the family. He was a slight young man with an uncertain manner and an expression that was currently hovering between apologetic and determined. "Miss Dalton," he said, through the gate, "I know I have no right to expect a welcome, and I am not asking for one. I simply wanted to find you because I felt I owed you a word." She looked at him steadily. "My mother learned the truth of what my father did," Clark Henderson said, in a rush, as if he had been rehearsing this and needed to get through it before his nerve failed. "Not everything, but enough." She confronted him, and he did not deny it well enough, "and she has written to the people in San Antonio who knew you, including your former employer before my father's family, and she has made clear that you were dismissed on false grounds." He pulled a folded letter from his coat. "She wanted you to have this, a letter of character from her. She said she hoped it might be of use." He hesitated. "She is sorry, and I am sorry. We should have done something earlier." Adelaide looked at the letter. She took it slowly. "Does your mother know where you have gone?" she asked. "She sent me," he said. "It took some time to find you." "Tell her," Adelaide said carefully, "that I accept the apology, and that I hope she finds the course of things improves for her." Clark Henderson nodded, the relief on his face considerable, and tipped his hat and turned back toward the horse he had tied to the post outside the fence. She turned and found Nelson standing 10 feet behind her, having come out of the house when Domingo told him. He looked at the letter in her hand and then at her face. "You did not need me for that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I was here if you did," he said. "I know," she said, and the warmth in her voice surprised even her. She read the letter from Clara Henderson that evening, in her room at Voss House by lamplight. It was a thorough letter, written by a woman who had clearly been carrying this for some time, and was determined to be completely clear now that she had made the decision. It spoke well of Adelaide's character and skill, and stated plainly that the previous dismissal had been made under circumstances that reflected poorly on the Henderson household, and not on Adelaide herself. She folded it and put it in the box under her bed where she kept her important papers, and she felt something that she could only describe as the closing of a door that had been blowing open in the wind for a long time, banging against its frame, letting in drafts. Closed now. Latch fixed. Done. She sat on the edge of her bed in the lamplight and thought about Nelson Mercer, who had kissed her in the garden and called her worth looking at with both eyes and shown up 3 times a week, and built her a case from the inside out until she could not argue herself back to where she had been. She thought that she might be in love with him, and this thought, which once would have terrified her, settled into her chest like something that simply belonged there. December arrived with a cold front that swept down from the north and turned Harlan Creek briefly, improbably beautiful, dusting the rooftops and the fence posts, and the scrubby live oaks at the edge of town, with a thin layer of frost that glittered in the morning light and was gone by 10 o'clock. Adelaide stood at the boarding house window with her coffee and watched it for 10 minutes before the morning's tasks pulled her away, and she thought that this was the first winter in several years that she had looked forward to. Nelson came to Voss House on a Thursday in the second week of December, which was unusual because Thursdays were Dorothea's charity meeting afternoons and Adelaide was usually deep in the kitchen by mid-morning. He came to the back door and knocked, and she let him in, floury hands and all, and he sat at the kitchen table while she finished the bread she was making. "I want to ask you something," he said after a little while. She glanced at him. He had his hat on the table and his hands folded in front of him, which was his posture for things he had thought carefully about. "Ask then," she said. "I want you to marry me," he said. "I have been wanting to ask for some time, and I thought I should wait until I was sure you were ready to hear it, and I believe you are, though I acknowledge I may be wrong about that. If I am wrong, you can say so." He looked at her directly. "But I love you, Adelaide. I have loved you since somewhere around the time you sat under that oak tree and told me what happened in San Antonio without flinching, and before that, if I am honest. Since the day you stood up in the chicken feathers and said you were fine when you clearly were not and held your chin up anyway." Adelaide set down the bread dough. She looked at him. He looked back. "You love me," she said. "Yes," he said. Despite the scarred jaw and the uncertain history and the faded dresses and, "Not despite," he said firmly. "Not despite any of it. The whole of you. I am not asking for a corrected version. I am asking for the one in front of me." Adelaide Dalton had spent a long time believing that love was something that happened to other women, the ones without scars and without histories, and without the particular kind of damage that accumulates when the world makes clear that you are not quite what it wanted. She had been wrong about that, she realized now, standing in Dorothea's kitchen with flour on her hands and Nelson Mercer looking at her like she was the most important thing in any room he had ever been in. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you," she said. "Are you surprised?" He exhaled something that was almost a laugh. "A little," he admitted. "I thought you might argue with me more." "I am working on that," she said. "Arguing less with things that are true." He stood up and came around the table and took her flour-dusty hands in his, and kissed her forehead and then her cheek, and then properly. And she held onto the front of his shirt, and thought that home was a stranger thing than she had expected it to be, a person-shaped thing, something you recognize not by its walls but by the way you breathe differently inside it. Dorothea came home from her charity meeting to find them sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, and she looked at their faces, and she said with complete composure, "About time," and put her coat on the hook and went to start supper. They married in the spring of 1883, in the church with the crooked steeple, on a Saturday afternoon in March when the bluebonnets were coming up in the fields east of town, and the sky was the particular clean blue that belongs only to Texas spring. The church was full because Harlan Creek was a town of 300 people, and the marriage of Nelson Mercer was a matter of genuine communal interest and something of a cause for celebration. Adelaide wore a dress that Clara Whitmore had helped her make, a deep blue that Clara said matched her eyes, and she wore her hair pinned with 2 small combs that had been Dorothea's mother's. She carried a bunch of wildflowers she had gathered that morning herself, because she had wanted to do that particular thing with her own hands. She walked into the church and saw Nelson at the front of it, standing straight in his best clothes, which Clara's husband the doctor had quietly and firmly advised him to update 2 weeks before the wedding, and he turned when she entered, and his face did the thing it sometimes did when he looked at her, that quiet, complete settling into something that was both wonder and recognition. She walked up the aisle and stood beside him, and the Reverend spoke the words, and Nelson spoke his with the same plain directness he brought to everything, and Adelaide spoke hers clearly, without hesitation, without looking anywhere but at his face. The town celebrated after with a dinner and dancing, and old Pete Garza on his fiddle playing with what everyone agreed was his finest performance in recent memory. likely because Clara Whitmore had promised him a full year's worth of Sunday dinners in exchange for his best effort. Nelson danced with Adelaide twice, and was still not a skilled dancer, and still did not care, and they were both laughing by the end of the second reel, standing breathless and happy in the lantern light while the town moved around them. And it was not unlike the 4th of July celebration, except that now his hand was in hers with the weight of something settled and certain. Dorothea cried at the wedding, which she would have denied if asked, and then immediately organized the feeding of 60 people with the brisk efficiency of a general, which was her way of processing emotion, and which Adelaide found entirely characteristic and entirely dear. Jasper Pell gave them a carved wooden horse, larger and more detailed than anything he had left on the dining room table before, with real horsehair for the mane that he had gotten from the livery stable. It was a remarkable thing. Adelaide kept it on the mantelpiece of the Mercer ranch house for the rest of her life. She moved into the ranch house after the wedding, which she had already begun to think of as home well before the ceremony made it official. She brought her carpet bag, now joined by 2 proper trunks that she had accumulated in the year at Voss House, and the box of important papers that now included Clara Henderson's letter, and the small carved figures from Jasper Pell, and the books she had borrowed and been given and bought with her wages, and the 2 hairpins that had been Dorothea's mother's, which she placed on the small dresser in the bedroom and thought of as belonging there. Nelson had painted the bedroom before the wedding, a fact she had discovered on a visit 2 weeks before, and had spent a moment genuinely touched and not quite sure how to express it. He had also built in the back of the house a small writing desk beside the window that looked out over the garden, because she had mentioned once that she sometimes wanted to write, had thought about keeping a journal or writing letters properly, and he had remembered this and built her a desk for it without saying anything, just showing it to her quietly and waiting to see if it was what she had meant. It was exactly what she had meant. She sat at it the first evening they were in the house together as a married couple after supper, while Nelson did the ranch accounts, and she opened a new blank journal that Dorothea had given her as a wedding gift and wrote the date at the top of the first page and then sat looking at the blank white space below it for a long moment. She wrote, "I was wrong about almost everything, and I am grateful for that." The first year of their marriage was both difficult and wonderful in the specific proportions that honest life tends to be. Difficulty and wonder not keeping to separate quarters but moving through the same days together. There was a drought in the summer of 1883 that hit the cattle ranches in the county hard, and Nelson spent long days and short nights managing the ranch through it with the determined calm of a man who has planned for hard seasons and trusts the planning. Adelaide managed the house and the kitchen garden with the same focused capability, learning the rhythms of the ranch, learning the language of cattle and grass and water that Nelson and his hands spoke in, understanding bit by bit the particular precariousness and resilience of a life built in that country. She helped with the ranch accounts when Nelson had too much to do in the evenings, discovering that she had an aptitude for figures that she had not known about, the particular clarity of numbers being a relief after the imprecision of most of life. Nelson looked at her tallied columns one evening with undisguised admiration. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "I have been watching you do it," she said. "And before that I kept accounts for a dress shop in San Antonio, before the Hendersons." "You never mentioned that," he said. "You never asked about the dress shop specifically," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Every time I think I know the full picture," he said, "there is another room I have not been in yet." "Is that a complaint?" she asked. "Not even slightly," he said. The drought broke in September and the relief of it was palpable across the whole county. The grass came back, the cattle recovered, and Nelson sat on the porch of the ranch house on the evening of the first good rain and breathed out a long, slow breath that contained an entire summer's worth of held tension. Adelaide sat beside him and they watched the rain come across the pasture, the smell of it rising sharp and clean, the sky darkening and running with gray, and the sound of water on the roof and the ground. "We are going to be all right," she said. "We are," he agreed. She took his hand and they sat like that in the sound of the rain until it passed, and when the stars came out after, washed clean and very bright, she felt the fullness of what she had, and she did not flinch away from it this time. She let herself feel it entirely. In the spring of 1884, Adelaide discovered she was expecting a child. She told Nelson on a Tuesday evening quietly in the kitchen, watching his face go through surprise, and then something that she could only describe as radiance, a luminous, unguarded happiness that she had not seen on him before, and that made her feel, absurdly, like crying, which she did briefly, and he held her in the kitchen with his arms around her, and his chin on top of her head, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. The pregnancy was not easy. She was sick for the first 3 months with a thoroughness that she bore with characteristic fortitude and minimal complaint, but which Nelson monitored with such attentive anxiety that she finally told him that she was not made of glass, and he did not need to look at her as though she might shatter every time she stood up too quickly. He accepted this correction with the good grace of a man who knows he is hovering, but cannot quite help it, and they found a middle ground in which he hovered at a slightly more comfortable distance. Dorothea came out to the ranch frequently and was an invaluable presence, bringing food and practical advice, and the particular brand of no-nonsense reassurance that was her specialty. Clara Whitmore came too, with her doctor husband, who examined Adelaide with professional thoroughness and announced that everything was proceeding exactly as it ought to. Miss Evelyn Cross, who had by now fully conquered her fear of horses and was riding with considerable confidence, came on Sunday afternoons and sat with Adelaide in the garden and read aloud, which Adelaide found deeply soothing. The baby arrived in November of 1884, a boy, born just as the first blue norther of the season swept down from the panhandle and made the windows rattle and the stove work hard. He was a healthy, determined baby with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, and he announced his arrival with a voice considerably louder than seemed proportional to his size. Nelson held him for the first time with the careful, reverent manner of a man who has never held anything so important, and his face was doing the radiance thing again, that wide-open gladness, and he looked from the baby to Adelaide with an expression that she thought she would keep in her chest for the rest of her life. "He is perfect," Nelson said. "He is very loud," Adelaide said from the pillow, exhausted and triumphant and overwhelmed in the best possible way. "He comes by that honestly," Nelson said. "Are you implying I am loud?" she said. "I am implying nothing," he said peacefully. "I am simply holding our son and being grateful." They named him James Dorothea Mercer, the middle name a small liberty with convention that Dorothea received with a dignity that did not quite hide how moved she was. Harlan Creek received the news of the birth with the enthusiasm of a small town that considers all its children collectively owned. Old Pete Garza played a celebratory tune outside the general store. Clara Whitmore organized a rotation of women bringing food to the ranch for the first 2 weeks. Jasper Pell left 3 new carved animals on the boarding house table to be delivered to the baby, which Adelaide thought was the most characteristic and most touching gesture she could imagine from that quiet man. James grew fast in the way of healthy babies, which is to say alarmingly fast, and by the following spring he was a wide-eyed, fascinated creature who observed the world with his father's considered attention and grabbed at everything within reach with his mother's determined efficiency. Nelson took him out to the corral when he was old enough to be held safely on the fence rail and showed him the horses with a seriousness that suggested he felt the proper introduction of a child to horses was a matter of some gravity. James reached out with both hands for the nearest horse's nose with complete fearlessness. "He has no sense of caution," Adelaide said, watching. "He has our combined personalities," Nelson said. Caution was not going to be the primary result. She laughed, and the sound went out across the pasture, wide and free, the way laughter does in open country. 18 months after James was born, Adelaide was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, the sickness briefer, and she managed with less fuss and more ease, moving through the ranch work and the accounts and the management of the house with the capable calm of a woman who has grown into the full dimensions of her own life. In the fall of 1886, they welcomed a daughter, a dark-haired girl who arrived quieter than her brother but no less determined, studying the world from her first moments with a focused attention that Nelson said was frightening in its intensity for a creature so recently arrived. They named her Me, and she was Nelson's undoing from the beginning in the gentle way that small daughters can be, not by manipulation, but simply by existing with such specific and radiant personhood that he could do nothing but be completely devoted. James, at not quite 2, was mystified by his sister, and then cautiously interested, and then, within a few weeks, fiercely protective in the way of older siblings who have decided the new arrival is theirs. Adelaide watched her family in the evenings, her son on his father's knee examining whatever object he had fixed on for the day, her daughter in the basket by the fire sleeping with her fists curled, the ranch house warm and lamplight, and the sound of wind in the eaves. And she thought of the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Harlan Creek with a faded carpet bag and a bruised heart, and the settled conviction that she was not worth a second glance. She thought of what Nelson had said that evening in the garden, that if she was not worth a second glance, good thing he used both eyes. She had thought at the time that it was a kind thing to say. She understood now that it was not only kind but true, that he had seen her clearly from the beginning, not a version of her that required her history to be different or her jaw to be smooth or her origins to be better, but her, the actual her, and had found something there worth building a life around. She was learning, slowly and not without continued effort, to agree with him. The years moved the way years do in the West, with seasons that each had their distinct character and demands, and Adelaide and Nelson moved through them together in the unremarkable, extraordinary way of people who have built something real and are tending it every day. The ranch grew steadily, not dramatically, but with the solid, sustainable growth of good management and hard work. Nelson added 20 acres to the east pasture in 1887 and a new barn the following year. He hired a fourth hand, a quiet Mexican man named Aurelio who had come from across the Rio Grande, and who was the best horseman any of them had ever seen, and who Nelson paid fairly and treated with the same respect he gave his other men, in a time and territory where this was not always the case, a fact that Adelaide noticed and respected. She had been thinking about the injustices of the West with increasing clarity in those years, watching the ways that Aurelio and Domingo, both Mexican men in a time when the border was still a relatively recent and contested thing, navigated a world that often treated them as lesser. She saw the way the Apache families that sometimes moved through the territory to the west were spoken about in town, in terms that ranged from fearful to contemptuous, and she found she had less patience for it the older she got. She talked to Nelson about it on evenings when they sat on the porch, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and the children were in bed. "The world is not fair," Nelson said on one of these evenings, "but a man can be, and that is within reach." "Is it enough?" she asked. "It is what we have," he said, "and it is more than nothing. We treat the people on this ranch right, we pay fair wages, we speak to people with dignity. We can do that, and we can raise our children to do it. That is a circle of fairness. Maybe it grows." "Maybe it does," she said, and thought that this was not a complete answer to the injustice of the world, but it was an honest one, and in the absence of complete answers, honest ones had considerable value. James started school in 1890, when he was 6, in the schoolhouse that Miss Evelyn Cross no longer taught in, since Evelyn had married a surveyor named Thomas Webb the previous spring and moved to Austin, but which now had a young teacher from New Orleans named Mr. Anton Renard, who was absolutely terrified of rattlesnakes, which Adelaide considered a reasonable and appropriate fear for the country, unlike Evelyn's fear of horses. James went to school with the same fierce concentration he brought to everything, and came home with the same. Me, at 4, was already conducting what could only be described as independent research into the ranch and its workings, following Aurelio around and asking questions with the relentless curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are inconvenient. Aurelio answered all of them with patient thoroughness, in both English and Spanish, and me began picking up Spanish words with the ease of a child's absorbing mind, which delighted Nelson and caused Adelaide to add Spanish lessons to her own quiet education, because she was not going to let her 4-year-old outpace her indefinitely. Dorothea remained a constant in their lives, coming out to the ranch on Sundays and on occasional weekdays, running Voss House with the efficiency and slightly reduced pace of a woman in her 60s who had earned the right to do things on her own schedule. She had a new boarder who helped her with the heavy work, a sensible young woman named Harriet who reminded Adelaide of herself at that age, which was a strange feeling to sit with. Jasper Pell had died in the winter of 1888, peacefully in his room at the boarding house, as if he had simply decided it was time and made the decision without drama. He left behind 3 months of rent paid in advance, which had annoyed and moved Dorothea in equal measure, and a box of unfinished wooden carvings which Adelaide kept and which James and me played with, and which Adelaide thought of as a particular kind of presence, the way some people continue to exist in the things they made with their hands. In 1892, Adelaide was 34 and Nelson was 37, and they had been married 9 years, and the ranch was as healthy as it had ever been, and their children were thriving, and the life they had built was solid and warm and real. She was sitting at the writing desk that Nelson had built for her, the one by the window that looked out over the garden, on a Tuesday morning in October, writing a letter to Miss Evelyn Webb in Austin, when she heard him come into the house from the morning's work. She heard him in the kitchen, and then his boots on the floor coming toward the small room she used for writing, and she looked up when he came to the door. He was 57 and still himself, the lines of his face deepened by years of sun and wind but carrying the same quality of steady, open attention, and his hair had gone gray at the temples in a way that she considered distinguished and had told him so, and he had told her she was biased, and she had told him that was entirely the point. "What are you writing?" he asked, leaning in the doorway. "A letter to Evelyn," she said. "She says Thomas's surveying work has taken them to the hill country, and she wants to know if I remember anything useful about the terrain from what you told me years ago." "Tell her it's beautiful and disorienting in equal parts," he said, "and to mind the heat in July." "Exactly what I was writing," she said. He came into the room and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly and felt the warmth of him and closed her eyes for a moment. "Adelaide," he said. "Nelson," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked. She opened her eyes and looked out the window at the garden, where the October light was doing something extraordinary with the late-season tomatoes and the dried stalks of the summer flowers, where me could be seen across the yard lecturing a very patient Aurelio about something with considerable authority, where the sounds of the ranch moved in the background like a familiar song. She thought of the stagecoach and the carpet bag and the dust of Harlan Creek and the chicken feathers and the faded dress, and the years of believing herself insufficient, less than, not worth looking at twice. She thought of the oak tree and the garden and the lantern light, and a man who had said, "Good thing I use both eyes," and had meant it every day since. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head and went back to the ranch work, and she turned back to her letter, and outside the window the October light moved across the garden, and me had now moved on from lecturing Aurelio to trying to catch the chickens that were running loose in the yard, and the sounds of the ranch were steady and warm, and Harlan Creek lay 4 miles to the west under a wide Texas sky. And the life she had almost talked herself out of deserving was here, fully present, entirely hers. She wrote to Evelyn, "The hill country is beautiful and disorienting in equal parts. Mind the heat in July. And if you find yourself lost in the scrubland, a neighboring rancher's wife may find you and give you biscuits and take you home on horseback without reproach. The West has that in it sometimes, generosity where you do not expect it. I have found more of it than I thought I had coming to me, and I am no longer arguing with the finding." She signed the letter and sealed it, and set it on the corner of the desk to be taken to the post office, and sat for another moment looking at the window and the garden and the improbable, magnificent fact of her own contentment. Then she stood up and went out into the yard to help me catch the chickens, which were a persistent problem that apparently ran in her life like a theme, and she was laughing before she reached the gate. The winter of 1892 was the coldest in years, cold enough that the creek at the edge of the Mercer property froze solid enough to walk on, which James discovered enthusiastically, and me followed with considerably more caution and considerably more noise about the fact that she was being cautious, apparently feeling that caution should be audible to receive proper credit. Nelson patched the barn roof against the cold and brought the most vulnerable cattle in from the far pasture, and the whole ranch hunkered down and managed with the practiced competence of people who have done this before and will do it again. Adelaide made a quantity of soup that she was fairly confident could have provisioned a small military expedition, and the hands came to the main house for supper most evenings during the worst of it, and the kitchen was warm and full of people and lamplight, and the sounds of talk and eating, and she thought this was one of the things she had not known she needed, this particular abundance of warmth and company and belonging. In February, when the worst of the cold had passed and the first tentative warmth was beginning, Nelson announced at breakfast that he had made arrangements for them to attend the county fair in the spring, which was held in the larger town of Caldera, 20 miles distant, and which Harlan Creek sent a contingent to every year. He had arranged for Aurelio to manage the ranch for the week, and for Clara and her husband to check in, and the four of them were going, all of them, as a family. James went rigid with excitement. Me asked 3 detailed questions about the horses there would be. Adelaide looked at Nelson across the breakfast table and felt the fullness of it again, that quiet, complete thing. They went to the fair in April, and it was everything a county fair in Texas in 1893 ought to be. Livestock competitions and agricultural displays and food and music and crowds of people from across the county meeting each other in the democratic, cheerful way of people gathered for the common purpose of celebration. James entered a school essay competition and won second place, and was furious about second place in a way that Adelaide thought boded well for his future efforts and required gentle management in the present. Me befriended a girl from Caldera named Rosa who shared her interest in horses with equal intensity, and the two of them spent 2 full days in close alliance, evaluating every horse at the fair with the authoritative seriousness of very small expert consultants. Nelson won a competition for the best-managed small ranch operation in the county, which was presented as a ribbon by a sweating judge in a good suit. And Adelaide applauded him, and James applauded him, and me said she had known this would happen, and that she had told Rosa it would, and Rosa had said so too. Nelson accepted the ribbon with characteristic modesty and put it in his coat pocket, and that evening, when the fair was winding down, and the lanterns were lit between the stalls and the music was playing from somewhere across the grounds, he took Adelaide's hand, and they walked through the fair grounds while James ran ahead with the barely contained energy of an 8-year-old who has not yet been told to slow down. And me walked very properly beside them, holding Adelaide's other hand, because me had determined that the fair called for dignity. They stopped at the edge of the grounds where the lanterns thinned out and the stars were visible above the wide Texas dark, and Nelson stood looking up for a moment, the ribbon in his pocket and his hat pushed back, and Adelaide looked at him and thought, not for the first time, that the most remarkable thing that had ever happened to her was that he had looked at her in the first place. He turned and caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. "Just thinking," she said. "About what?" he asked. "About a chicken in Harlan Creek," she said. He laughed, low and warm, and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood under the Texas stars while their children's voices carried across the fairground, and the music played on, and the night was wide and full of good things. Spring turned into summer and summer into fall, and the years continued their turning, and the Mercer ranch and the Mercer family moved through all of it together. James grew tall and serious, and turned out to have a gift for mathematics that his schoolteacher, Mr. Renard, discovered and encouraged with considerable enthusiasm, and by the time James was 12, he was helping with the ranch accounts in a way that both impressed and mildly unsettled Adelaide because she had thought that was her domain. And James pointed out with the merciless clarity of the young that he was simply very good at it, and Adelaide conceded this graciously. Me at 10 was still asking questions of everyone within range, and had added reading to her repertoire with a veracity that had emptied the Harlan Creek lending library twice. And Nelson ordered books from a catalog for her, anything she asked for, which was a long list, and me read them all and came back with more questions, which was exactly as it should be. Dorothea's health began to fail in 1895, not dramatically but in the gradual, unmistakable way of age, and Adelaide went to Voss' house more frequently, first to help, and then because she knew time was shortening and she wanted to be present in it. Dorothea allowed being helped with a grace that was characteristic of her, making it clear that she was accepting assistance as a practical matter rather than a defeat, which Adelaide found entirely characteristic and entirely moving. She sat with Dorothea on an afternoon in the autumn of 1895 while the old woman rested in the room she had kept for 30 years, and the light came through the window the way it did in October, and Dorothea said, looking at the ceiling, "You have done well, Adelaide." "You gave me the chance to," Adelaide said. "I gave you honest work in a clean room," Dorothea said. "What you did with it was your own." "And Nelson's," Adelaide said. Dorothea's expression shifted into something warm and quiet. "He loves you the right way," she said. "That matters more than people think it does, not the dramatic declarations, the everyday of it, the showing up and the paying attention." "He is very good at both," Adelaide said. "He is," Dorothea agreed. "And so are you." She closed her eyes. "I am glad you came to Harlan Creek," she said. "It would have been a much less interesting 3 years if you had not." "It was almost 4, Adelaide said. "Almost 4, Dorothea said, with the faint smile of a woman who has always known exactly how long everything was and saw no reason to revise it. Dorothea Voss died in the winter of 1895, peacefully, in her own room at Voss House, at the age of 67. She left the boarding house to Adelaide, along with a letter written in the precise, no-nonsense hand that Adelaide recognized, which said that the house was being left to someone who would know what to do with it, and that Adelaide should under no circumstances be sentimental about it but should make practical decisions, and that the flower boxes under the windows needed new soil in the spring because the flowers had been struggling, and she had not gotten around to it, and she trusted Adelaide to remedy this. Adelaide was sentimental about it anyway, and then practical about it, in that order because that was how she processed most things, and Dorothea would have understood this even if she would not have endorsed it. She kept Voss House, hiring a capable woman from town to run it, visiting often, maintaining it as a place that was both a working boarding house and something she thought of as a piece of Dorothea still present and useful in the world, which she thought was what Dorothea would have wanted. Clara Whitmore helped her sort through Dorothea's belongings, a task that Adelaide had not anticipated being as moving as it was, the accumulated objects of a woman's life laid out and organized, and made sense of in the way that people try to make sense of things after they have lost them. They found in the back of a wardrobe a box of letters from Adelaide's mother to Dorothea, written over many years, and Adelaide took the box home and read them over the course of a week, and the reading was a kind of restoration, giving her back something of the woman she had lost and connecting her, through those letters, to the girl she had been. She showed them to Nelson. He read a few of them with the careful attention of a man who understands he is being trusted with something important, and then he said, "She sounds like you, the way she says things." "Is that good?" Adelaide asked. "It is very good," he said. She thought about the chain of it, her mother who she had lost too early, Dorothea who had been a kind of second version of that belonging, the letter from Clara Henderson that had restored something of her reputation, and all the ways that women in her life had known her and kept her and sent her forward. She thought that there was a generosity in that chain that she wanted to continue, and she thought of the young woman Harriet who ran Voss House now, and of me with her 10,000 questions, and of all the women who came after that she would not know yet but who she could shape the world for in small ways, a clean room and honest work, and the willingness to say clearly that a person is worth more than they have been led to believe. The turn of the century came, and Harlan Creek was the same and different, as towns are after 2 decades of living. The main street had grown by 3 storefronts. The church had a new and straight steeple. There was a new school with 2 rooms instead of 1. The wagon tracks were occasionally shared with the first automobiles that came through the county, which the horses found alarming and which Nelson viewed with a measured, practical assessment, not hostile to progress but not rushing toward it either. James was 16 and reading books on engineering by mail order, talking about going to study in the East eventually, which Adelaide had mixed feelings about, and which she managed by being supportive about it in conversation and thinking about it privately with the bittersweet complexity of a mother watching a child prepare to be launched into a larger world. Nelson was simply proud, in the straightforward, uncomplicated way of a man who wants his children to exceed him. Me was 14, and had developed a talent for drawing that surprised everyone including herself, producing sketches of the ranch animals and the landscape and the people around her with a precision and life that Clara's husband, who had some art appreciation, said was genuinely remarkable. She wanted to study art. Adelaide ordered her supplies from a catalog, and Nelson built her a small north-facing studio room in the corner of the house, because north light was what you needed, and me moved into it and began producing work with the focused intensity of someone who has found the exact shape of what they are supposed to do. On a Sunday evening in October of 1900, when the air was cool and the sky was doing the wide, star-scattered thing it did in the fall, Adelaide and Nelson sat on the porch of the ranch house that had been their home for 17 years, in the rocking chairs that they had bought at a market 6 years ago, and which had become as much a part of the porch as the porch itself. James was inside studying. Me was in her studio, visible through the window, her lamp burning with the focus of someone who does not notice time when she is working. The ranch was quiet around them in the satisfied way of a well-run place at the end of a good day. "Nelson," Adelaide said. "Adelaide," he said. She looked at him, at the gray at his temples and the lines in his face and the warm brown eyes that were the same eyes that had looked at her in the chicken feathers in 1882, that had looked at her in the garden and in the kitchen, and at the altar, and across the breakfast table, and through 17 years of mornings and evenings and everything between. "I was thinking," she said, "about what you said that first September in the garden." "I said a great many things in that garden," he said. "You said good thing I use both eyes," she said. He looked at her. The stars were coming out above the pasture, slow and bright. "I remember," he said. "I thought it was generous," she said. "At the time, I thought you were being kind about something that was less than you were making it. I thought you were being generous about a deficit." "I know you did," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "I know that too," he said quietly. "I have been waiting for you to finish knowing it as well." "I am finished," she said. I believe I am finally finished arguing with it." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair, and held it in the easy, certain way of someone who has been doing this for nearly 2 decades and still means it every time. "Good," he said simply. The night settled around them, warm and wide, and full of the particular piece of a life honestly built and tended with care. The lamp burned in Me's studio and James's light was in the window, and the sounds of the ranch moved in the dark around them. The horses in the pasture and the crickets in the grass, and somewhere in the far dark, the long call of a coyote answered by silence. Adelaide Dalton Mercer sat on her porch in the October night with her husband's hand in hers and the life she had built around her in all directions, and she thought that she had come a long way from the woman who had stood in the dust of Harlan Creek with a faded carpet bag and the conviction that she was insufficient. She had come all the way here, and here was, without question, exactly where she was supposed to be. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The stars turned overhead the way they had always turned, and the night was wide, and they were, in every sense that mattered, home.